So we're going to try a different comparison today. I've been comparing shows from the late 80s, early 90s to shows of today within the last 10 years, kind of the contemporary design. And mostly what we've been looking for is the similarity in design choices, not the aesthetics, but rather in dealing with complexity and difficulty and what you ask of the members in the group to do, particularly as it relates to drill and music. What is the relationship between the movement and the music, and what can you ask a member reasonably to do on the move, and what can you reasonably ask them to do in motion with the music they're given. So that's what we've been doing, and I've given you a couple examples of that and just throwing out my opinions. Again, you probably have a lot of different opinions on a number of things, and you may be shouting at the screen as you're watching and saying, pointing out the things that I am not talking about. I can't say everything for sure, and I kind of have a one-track motive here in watching these and commenting on them. Please feel free to add your comments to the discussion so that we can further the discussion on it. But today what we're going to do is we're going to look at two Cavalier shows, because I haven't touched the Cavaliers in this, and they have a very distinctly different kind of drill from the other Drumcorps, at least in the time from where we were looking at to the time present, and in that time in between they were a dominant force in championships through the 2000s. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare the first time that they won a championship to the last time that they won a championship. So we're looking at Cavaliers 1992, and we're going to compare the Brubeck Age of Drill, the very tail end of that, to the kind of the tail end of the Michael Gaines era of drill for the Cavaliers, and compare the very beginning of their success to kind of the last time that we saw them at the very top of the leaderboard there. So I think mostly what we're going to be looking at is similarity. What is the influence between the two? I will note a few things about design related to the discussion that we've been having concerning difficulty and proficiency. How, as I have been stating in my thesis, really nothing has changed with respect to what you expect members to do with music and drill together. I'll point a little bit of that out, but mostly I think we're just going to make this a Cavaliers kind of video. We're just going to talk about similarities and differences and comparing and contrasting. We'll talk a little bit about some of the gripes that people actually had about particularly the 2006 era. People actually complained back then. I know that seems hard to believe. It seems like really the only things to complain about are the present issues, but actually people complained an awful lot in the 2000s about how shows were being written and put together, and we've forgotten that, I think. A lot of complaining going on, particularly about the music, and we're going to address that and what the complaint was, and maybe just bring it up for the sake of considering whether that was a terribly valid complaint or not to make at the time. I don't think it was terribly valid, but we'll leave it up to you to decide. So let's get into it. We'll look at 1992 Cavaliers, and then we'll compare and contrast with 2006 Cavaliers. So enjoy our Cavaliering today. This is the 1992 Cavaliers. I believe this is the last drill of Steve Brubeck. This was a very sad time for the Drumcorps. I know Brubeck had become ill by this time. I think he wrote this drill. He may have had some help, or they may have already transitioned, I don't know, but this is heavily influenced by him and his style. He passed away the year following. It opens up with the Gavorkina Fanfare, which is a Jack Stamp piece. Jack Stamp writes short pieces, not entirely, but a lot of his works are kind of shorter concert band works, wind ensemble works, a number of fanfares. This is the only one I know that made its way to the Drumcorps field, but there are some others that are very similar. They simplified some of it, I know, from the piece. I'm familiar with the piece, and I knew Jack Stamp from where I grew up in western Pennsylvania and played a number of regional ensembles under him, under his direction. And I remember this being some discussion when they did this show, how they had simplified a few things. They also added a few complexities you can hear there in the mellophones that were not in the original. So you have to make pieces idiomatic for Drumcorps, which means changing it a little bit so that you can showcase different voice parts that are unique to drum and bugle corps. And also, again, as part of our discussion has been, you have to make things accessible for certain kinds of visual moments. So a few adjustments in the music. This show is like a well-programmed concert band concert. There's a great deal of diversity in the music, and they're very separate movements. One of the complaints about shows these days, although people I think they forget, is that back in the day, the recollection is that Drumcorps would play long pieces of music and play them kind of through more respectful to the original composition. And now shows use smaller sections of music that may be rearranged or recomposed or reorganized into kind of a new composition. I don't think that's disrespectful at all. I mean, really, when you think about, even we looked at 1987, the Aaron Copland show. It's not exactly the piece. You have to rearrange and shorten and kind of move parts into different places to make it work. Wonderful visuals here, and this is going to heavily influence the future. I want to point out this drill move. If you really think about what's going on, this is a study in shapes and how they relate to each other. Each one of those is really just an independent line moving in a direct motion, either north to south, east to west, and the way that they fit together gives you the visual. So in and of itself, the member level movement is quite accessible, but the overall picture is complex. That's excellent writing, to make it such that the members can very easily execute it and learn it, and then at the same time project a very complicated visual moment for the audience to appreciate. And that's going to continue in the Michael Gaines era. Michael Gaines picked up a lot of this style and ran with it. I think one thing you'll notice different, because there's going to be a lot similar between this and what we see in 2006, but one thing that I think you're going to notice different is that the form is a little bit more compressed in the Gaines era, and some of that has to do with the application more of block formation and a little bit less of linear formation. So it's still a study in how shapes fit together in the Gaines era. The difference is that the shapes are made up of dense blocks more so of dense blocks rather than longer, bigger, linear groupings of members, of players. Beautiful music. Again, it's like a concert band program, very major contrast between these movements. I think that's something that people really appreciated appreciate now from the past, was being able to you could listen to a Drumcorps show and not see it and like it. It's like it's a brass band with the front ensemble really serving kind of as a pianistic accompaniment, but the meat and potatoes is in the horn line. It's in the brass section. That's not so much the way it is now. The responsibilities are very shared, and I think it's erroneous, again, back to the thesis of all these videos. I think it's erroneous to think that is a change in difficulty. It's just not true. It's a change in responsibility, a change in the aesthetic, but it's not a change in difficulty. At least not for the worse, not in a negative way. Very diverse music. I like that move. That's neat. The decompression of those geometric shapes, the triangles, and then you see the way they move together. So each group is a straight dot-to-dot lateral move. And the shapes fit together. That was a neat move there too. You have an outside square rotating opposite of an internal block formation, and you can see how it's dot-to-dot, point-to-point movement because the square compresses and then expands. You'll notice in the games era when blocks are rotating, it looks a little bit more like what you see right there, where there's a curvature, there's a curved path to most of those motions rather than a dot-to-dot path, compression, expansion. That requires more subsetting, which means more data to learn, and we'll talk about that later on when we look at 2006. The comparison of just information that members have to know these days. That's a great drill move right there. Again, a pinwheeling motion, but it's again a study in the way shapes can fit together as they rotate, so that things are not in the way of themselves. Really interesting in this musical section, kind of the way the music determines the drill, which is how things worked back in the day. That's more so how I think designers thought. They would arrange music and then they would design the drill to the music they had. When we look forward to 2006, that responsibility seems to flip on its head. And complaints were made about that at the time, and I think we forget some of the disdain that people had for that kind of show design. And I think that continues today. People complain about how the staging and the visual determines so much of the music. And you can see the converse here. They're writing visuals that fit the music. And when you have abstract music like this, more abstract, I guess. There's that great move again. Lines are just moving in their respective east to west, north to south motion, and they fit together to make a larger visual. But when people lost my train of thought there. When people complain about the kind of state in 2006 and then today, they would prefer, I think, that the music drive the drill because they want to be able to hear the music by itself. I remember what I was saying. So when you have abstract music like that, it starts to look very similar to what you see in 2006, where you have drill and then you have to write abstract music to match the drill. It's just an inverted line of influence. Ends up looking the same. Point out a lot of the show has a lot of movement without playing. Body motions, this is very similar in a lot of ways to the 2000s era for the Cavaliers. You could almost put 1992 in that era and see that it would work. Cavaliers. So, just a few things about it, just to recap. Again, there's a lot of moving and not playing, just to return back to that old thesis going on here. So back then, they did it. We have a very jaded view of the past. The Cavaliers organization was very interested in visual, the visual content of their shows. And you'll see later on when we get to 2006, but even back in 1992, and the preceding shows right up before this, as they were kind of building up to this win. This win was kind of a long time coming for them. They were doing a number of shows that were in the same kind of design. They were very interested in throwing kind of a softball to the audience. They wanted them to be wowed by the visuals. They wanted unmistakable visual formations that the audience didn't have to scratch their head over. They didn't want they portrayed a lot less amoebic sort of linear drill and more of this geometric kaleidoscopic formation for the audiences of the time. It was a hole. It was a kind of a hole in design that they were willing to fill. And it wasn't until about that 2000s era that other drum corps really started to emulate it more actively in their designs. Once you get into the Michael Gaines era, drum corps visual design really started to copy that perspective into their shows. And that persists to today. A lot of the kaleidoscopic geometric stuff that we see now really was only made possible by Steve Brubeck and his influence, and then Michael Gaines and his consistency with that style during the powerhouse time, the powerhouse era of the Cavaliers in the 2000s. So next we're going to take a look at 2006, and we'll compare and contrast. I think we're going to be finding more similarities than contrast, really, between the two. Again, I'll note the big difference, I think, is just the overall amount of information that will be different between these two eras. There's just a lot more stuff going on in 2006 that the members have to commit to memory and learn. And of course, I think the difficulty does increase a little bit, but again, we've covered why that is, about the talent base that you get, and the expansion of drum and bugle corps, I think, as a subculture. That's probably worth mentioning too. There's a lot of talk about how, and there has been for a number of years, about how the subculture of drum corps seems to be getting smaller and smaller. I don't think that's true. I think it gets bigger and bigger and bigger compared to the time back then. While a lot of people knew about it, I don't think there was a lot of involvement at that time in school music programs. They sort of knew about it, but competitive marching bands were sort of regional. There wasn't a major national push for competitive marching band that modeled after drum and bugle corps. And it wasn't until the end of the 90s into the 2000s and so on where you start to get that. And I think nowadays you see a lot more field band, national field band groups really emulating drum and bugle corps. Kids at various schools know what drum and bugle corps is. They'll know what the leading corps are and how they're being copied and emulated. So I think that the subculture has grown considerably actually since then. I think what has happened, though, is that subculture from that time that was clinging to that aesthetic, a lot of them have moved away from drum corps because of the changes in the aesthetics. And they were moving away, a long time ago. It's not something that's happened recently. A big complaint that was made had to do with the music and how the music was being composed. We'll talk about that more as we look at 2006. But there was a real big problem in that Cavalier era with the way shows were being written and the lower position that the music seemed to have in the show design. And believe it or not, people were complaining that the shows were easier and easier and easier in the Cavalier era because of that. I don't think it's true. I don't buy into that. Just like I don't buy into it today. I think really the design choices are quite consistent from the very beginning to the end. But we'll address those complaints. And it seems almost unthinkable today, looking back on the 2000s, thinking that people actually complained about that, but they did. So let's take a look at 2006. We'll make a fun comparison here between the first time that the Cavaliers won to the most recent time that the Cavaliers took a championship. Okay, Cavaliers 2006 Machine.
Illinois, presenting their 2006 program, Machine.
And this is mostly Richard Sissoto music. I think there's some other stuff in there as well. They kind of went back and forth during this period. But they really focused on a lot of custom written music for their shows, and that'll be evident as we watch it. The music was, in my opinion, fantastic, but unremarkable. You couldn't, again, the criticism at the time, that I think has been forgotten, is that you can't very easily, without some kind of pre-existing appreciation, just listen to this, these shows. You really needed to see them, because the music served the visual so much. This show ties in very well to the analysis of the other comparison videos. You will note a great deal of time that they spend to march in formation without playing in this era, especially in this show. The music is not terribly difficult either, at least on a brass level. I think the percussion's a different story. They were very well known for hot percussion lines at this time. It doesn't need to be difficult. It just doesn't, they don't have to play hard stuff to have a hard show, A technically proficient, well-composed program. A lot of front ensemble. Very similar visual aesthetics to 1992. This is in that era when Drumcorps wore a uniform that was nondescript about their show, apart from the color guard. And then they portrayed a theme, just in marching and playing. Beautiful contrast in motion. Follow the leader. Block formation. I think at this time, this was an era of this contrasting motion block formation that Michael Gaines was writing that was starting to be emulated by Drumcorps. You can look at various times in drum and bugle corps where you see champions determining kind of the pathway of shows. And I think Michael Gaines' drill was one of those benchmarks for that. No playing, just a lot of visual, hand motions. And again, the visual is so obvious that I think the analogy here is that the show is, it's like a softball pitch, a slow pitch, right down the middle of home plate in the dead center of the strike zone. The audience can't miss on this. They know exactly what's supposed to be happening. The Cavaliers of this era really took the audience seriously. They wanted to give them something, and the judges, that didn't need explanation. And the Bluecoats would pick up on that later. 10 years later. Great design. Very similar to 92. It's not that different visually, apart from the tighter formations that we see. Technically more difficult in the playing, but notice as the playing gets very technical, they get a little more stationary. This show is a gag a minute. I mean, there's always something happening. I noticed a comment in the threads recently here about having too many impacts and kind of being oversaturated. You know, this show has, I guess by that measure, way too many impacts, but you don't get tired of it. You're just waiting for the next one. You can't wait for it. Back here, you know, that's the influence of Brubaker. I couldn't find a high cam version of this, but because it's the Cavaliers, when they're trying to get the shots, they're fairly zoomed out most of the time. It's just the way the drill is. There's no question what's going on in the drill. You know, you see it and you understand. Dot to dot drill. Things slow down for the ballad because it's appropriate. Big visuals. Very subtle things. Not in themselves hard to do, but they're just very powerful, very impactful visual. I would think that's hard to do. I don't know. I've never done it. Boy, they're terribly consistent with their theme in this one too. They play out the theme on a very small level, member to member, especially in the guard work. Projecting the concept of machines, of mechanisms moving, gears, cogs. Very unremarkable music. You forget this music as soon as the show is over. You don't really remember it. It's just very pretty chordal progressions going on here. I think this might be the one piece that is not Sasado. I think this is a Marsalis piece. I can't remember. But even in their choice of this music, it's not a Cavalier groove, which they were known for too at that time on some shows. When you look back to the Four Corners show in 2001, to reference that one again, that had a very singable groove that the audience was left whistling as they went away from the show. Check out this guard stuff here with the equipment. Every 2 or 3 members is an independent machine. Very clever detail aesthetically. Again, it's a softball, slow pitch, right down the middle of home plate in the middle of the strike zone for the audience. They just can't miss the meaning. This is a great visual coming up here. The hardest thing about this isn't what they're doing. It's the hardest part of this was probably thinking about it at the drafting table. When James wrote it. Very low velocity, but just really remarkable visual. it's not about hard. It's not about difficult sometimes. Sometimes it's really just about the design. And maybe that's a lament that people have, today. That they wish they had more attention given to that principle. To kind of provide an apologetic for the critics of now. A desire for some simplicity to return. Brilliant kaleidoscopic move here. And this is hard, actually. This is a little bit more complicated to keep clean and dressed up because you have, it's not merely point to point. It has to be subset so that you get curvature in the movement. Gag a minute. It's something going on all the time. For all of the shtick in this show, it's very highbrow shtick. I mean, it's really smart. Great compression move. Not hard, just smart. Real smart. I think what made these shows more complicated for members on the member level is the amount of data that they had to remember. Just all the subsetting and points that they had to coordinates they had to remember. This era of design, I think, in the similarity that it bears to today, if you're going to make a comparison and draw a similarity between this show and the things we see today, there's an awful lot of information to remember. A lot more than what we see back in the late 80s and 90s. And I think that bears out in the amount of time that Drumcorps today put into the spring training, the move-in time. Typically these days the drum line will move in a week or two ahead of the rest of the corps, so they get a jump on their parts and their drill in association with the parts. At least that initial presentation of their show, because these days the initial presentation of the show can be pretty different from the last one, and they often are learning multiple versions of drill now at the early in the season, so that they can trade out drill and show concepts later on, and that's in the interest of increasing their point value over time, among other things. It's just one of the strategies. But there's just so much information. You have the drum line moving in a couple weeks ahead, 1 or 2, and you're spending 4 or 5 weeks learning your show. That's a lot more time spent than back in the late 80s and 90s, where you had a 2-week move-in, something like that. Well, depending on which drum corps you're with, but they're spending almost a month now in preparation before the first show, and the reason is because there's just a lot more data. There's a lot more stuff to know. You have to take this a little bit of the time. The human brain and muscle memory can take only so much, so you have to give it the right amount of time to get it all learned. A lot of data in there. So 2 Cavalier shows, the first time that they won compared to the last time that they won. In my opinion, they're overdue for another win. I would love to see them come back. I think they've been working very hard to rejuvenate the program and try to update their goals a little bit to today's kind of aesthetic. I hope you enjoyed this comparison. A lot of similarities. I think there's more similarity than differences when you look at these types of shows and compare them together. The differences, I think, are found in the focus on visual. when you compare the two. The second show, really the visual drove it. I think it's pretty apparent that the visual really drives the design of everything else. I think Michael Gaines was given a lot of license to really define what the show was going to be and how it was going to be portrayed, and then everything else kind of fit in around that. Whereas back in the day, in '92, that show sounded and looked a lot more like the other shows going on around it, except that it had the Brubaker sort of style to it, a more geometric, straight line, kaleidoscopic, linear form drill, wider drill than what we see here in 2006, but still linear, less curvature to it. So hopefully you enjoyed this one, and until the next time, have a good one.